Buonasera. A nome dell'Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei e più precisamente del Presidente Giorgio Parisi e del Vicepresidente Roberto Antonelli, sono molto lieto di portare i saluti anzitutto alla relatrice di questa sera, la professoressa Bina Agarwal, che ci intratterà con la Annual Balzan Lecture, di cui il Presidente De Cleva, Presidente della Fondazione Balzan, darà la razionalità dell'iniziativa stessa e anche la partecipazione del collega Roncaglia che è qua, del professor Brunori che è qua, è stato tanti anni vicepresidente dell'Accademia e presidente della classe di Scienze Fisiche e Matematiche Naturali, e del professor Caputo che è il nostro decano e come tale è un giovane che però, essendo entrato molto giovane all'Accademia dei Lincei, è diventato decano rapidamente, nel senso che essendo entrato molto giovane lo è diventato. Sono anche molto lieto di vedere parecchi giovani qui con noi e sono anche molto lieto di aver appreso che il ministro signora Bellanova verrà tra poco perché desidera conoscere la professoressa Bina Agarwal, di cui poi io darò un'adeguata, spero, presentazione, e anche in qualche modo parlare con lei per possibili future iniziative. Quindi grazie ancora. Di nuovo porto a tutti voi i saluti del Presidente Parisi e del Vicepresidente Antonelli e chiedo al professore De Cleva, che è Presidente della Fondazione Internazionale Balzan Premio, di prendere la parola. Dove vuoi tu, Enrico? Sì.
Buonasera, è come sempre un grande piacere, un grande onore essere in questa sala. Ormai i legami tra l'Accademia dei Lincei e la Fondazione Balzan sono molto stretti e costanti negli anni e è un piacere particolare tenere qui ogni 2 anni la Balzan Lecture, che è tenuta da un vincitore, da un premiato Balzan. A questo proposito devo dire specialmente ai giovani che non penso sappiano molto del premio Balzan, che una delle caratteristiche di questo premio rispetto ad altri magari più famosi ma non poi tanto più dotati quanto a risorse che mettono a disposizione del vincitore, ha la caratteristica, dico il premio Balzan, di essere assegnato ogni anno in aree disciplinari diverse, scelte di volta in volta. Non vengono dati premi alla medicina, alla fisica o alla matematica, vengono dati premi per settori meno ampi, più definiti, con la possibilità quindi per il Comitato Generale Premi che decide al riguardo di individuare di volta in volta settori disciplinari meritevoli di essere segnalati, meritevoli di essere indicati come settori importanti, anche se magari non hanno, come dire, una grande anzianità accademica. Questo permette di mettere in luce, mettere in evidenza appunto ambiti magari innovativi, ambiti nei quali magari negli ultimi anni si è lavorato molto, e quindi di segnalare studiosi che sono importanti per il loro lavoro, ma sono anche, meritano attenzione anche per l'ambito di studi che coltivano. È in questa prospettiva che nel 2016 il Comitato Generale Premi ha deciso di dedicare uno dei 4 premi dell'anno successivo agli studi di genere. E la fortuna ha voluto che tra le candidature per questo premio ci fosse quello della professoressa Agarwal. Devo dire che in questo modo, se posso permettermi di essere un po' leggero, poco accademico, abbiamo dato forse non un premio, ma 3 premi, perché abbiamo certamente premiato gli studi di genere, ma abbiamo certamente premiato la studiosa di economia dello sviluppo, che si è segnalata per studi importanti, e siccome Bina Agarwal non è soltanto una studiosa ma è anche attiva, e i suoi studi, le sue ricerche hanno un effetto nella realtà, in un certo senso le abbiamo assegnato anche un po' del nostro quinto premio, quello che diamo a intervalli più rarefatti, quello sulla fratellanza, l'umanità e la pace. La motivazione per la quale Bina Agarwal ha ricevuto il premio Balzan nel 2017 è la seguente: per avere messo in discussione i fondamenti tradizionali dell'economia e delle scienze sociali attraverso una innovativa prospettiva di genere, per aver accresciuto la visibilità e l'empowerment delle donne in ambito rurale nel sud del mondo, per aver aperto nuove vie intellettuali e nuove prospettive politiche nei settori cruciali dello sviluppo dal punto di vista di genere. Alberto Quadrio Curzio parlerà subito dopo e credo dirà cose più pertinenti sulla carriera di ricerca e sui percorsi seguiti dalla professoressa Agarwal, ma credo che non si possa non accennare appunto a quanto Bina Agarwal abbia sollevato questioni inedite, poco note, poco conosciute, e abbia seguito una traiettoria realmente indisciplinare nel suo percorso di ricerca, coniugando economia, giurisprudenza, etnografia, sociologia, scienze politiche, antropologia, arrivando a intuizioni e risposte importanti e originali, che non solo hanno avuto un significato, diciamo, accademico, ma hanno anche influito sulle politiche di governi, di ONG, di agenzie internazionali, impegnati nell'eliminazione delle disuguaglianze di genere in tutte le sue forme. Quindi è oggi un onore, un piacere poter ascoltare la sua lecture. Finisco da dove avrei dovuto forse cominciare, cioè dai ringraziamenti. Ringrazio la professoressa Agarwal per aver accettato il nostro invito in un periodo densissimo di impegni, quindi di aver ritagliato un po' di tempo per venire a Roma, e ringrazio l'Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei che ci ospita e alla quale siamo legati da una convenzione insieme con le Accademie Svizzere delle Arti e delle Scienze, una convenzione per la quale si è in particolar modo impegnato e che continua a seguire con grande attenzione Alberto Quadrio Curzio, al quale cedo subito la parola.
Grazie professor De Cleva per le sue gentili, amichevoli parole nei miei confronti, della sua attenzione costante all'Accademia dei Lincei e della sua sensibilità, che è stata ben dimostrata dalla sua presentazione oggi, nel capire come il contributo di Bina Agarwal rappresenti davvero un unicum in quelle che potremmo definire le scienze sociali o le scienze umane che hanno un forte contenuto sociale. E nell'ambito di queste scienze umane, con forte contenuto sociale e anche istituzionale, l'economia politica si colloca. Ciascuno di noi, quando parla di una persona che ammira, tende anche a richiamare degli aspetti, non dico autobiografici, ma di conoscenza antica con una persona. E io credo di aver incontrato Bina Agarwal molti anni fa a Cambridge, ma soprattutto ho approfondito la sua conoscenza, pur avendo già piena contezza dei suoi lavori, quando in Argentina ella divenne vicepresidente della International Economic Association. Non so se prima di lei un'altra scienziata, economista politica avesse mai ottenuto quella posizione, ma mi impressionò la unanimità che portò lei a quella posizione. Unanimità mista anche di una certa, come dire, attenzione anche un po' preoccupata, perché la capacità innovativa che lei imprimeva alla economia politica dal punto di vista sociale, istituzionale, degli studi di genere, non era allineata con il mainstream, cioè col pensiero dominante. Quindi lei ottenne in quella elezione un grande successo, perché era ovviamente impossibile negare i suoi meriti, ma nello stesso tempo un atteggiamento di cautela, perché i suoi studi non erano esattamente collocati nel mainstream, nella teoria dominante o nella dottrina dominante, perché poi dalla teoria si passa alla dottrina, dalla dottrina si passa qualche volta all'ideologia, e tutto questo rappresenta un impoverimento delle scienze umane. Bina Agarwal rappresenta, a mio avviso, la vera espressione di quella che si può definire l'economia politica come scienza sociale e scienza umana, su un campo che da prima non era mai stato approfondito con la sua attenzione, la sua profondità. Ecco, tra i moltissimi lavori che certamente non posso richiamare qui, io vorrei proprio partire da quello che rappresenta una svolta evidente negli studi sulle diseguaglianze di genere, che è A Field of One's Own, pubblicato dalla Cambridge University Press nel 1944 e che aveva già avuto parecchie sue anticipazioni. Secondo me questo studio rappresenta veramente una svolta che rimarrà nella storia dell'economia politica per il metodo, per le finalità e anche per il coraggio. Per quanto riguarda, ecco il Ministro, buonasera Ministro, piacere di vederla qua con noi, è un grande piacere, il professor De Cleva, vederla qua con noi, e sono certo che anche la professoressa Agarwal è molto lieta. Dicevo, ha rappresentato dal punto di vista del metodo, dal punto di vista delle finalità e dal punto di vista anche, come ovvio, della innovazione. Per quanto riguarda il metodo, Bina Agarwal, in questo come negli altri suoi studi, ha affiancato il rigore dell'oggettività nell'analisi dei dati con anche delle rilevazioni personali dirette sulla situazione delle differenze di genere, soprattutto nei paesi in via di sviluppo e in India, andando a fare degli studi sul campo, quindi non si è limitata a prendere in considerazione le statistiche pubblicate, note, ma è andata anche a fare delle indagini sul campo per confermare questi dati. Un lavoro faticosissimo, direi un lavoro quasi eroico, perché le condizioni di disagio per fare queste indagini sul campo erano enormi. Quindi lei non ha buttato una idea, ma ha voluto dimostrare attraverso l'analisi dei dati e attraverso le ricerche sul campo qual era la situazione. Secondo me la seconda sua finalità, oltre alla finalità scientifica oggettiva di rendere evidente una situazione di profonda ingiustizia, discriminazione, che tra l'altro in uno dei suoi scritti, forse in quello stesso che ha distribuito oggi, richiama i 4 grandi principi scritti nella Rivoluzione francese e aggiunge a quello la giustizia come elemento senza il quale gli altri 4 non possono reggere. Giustizia. Quindi una fortissima motivazione ideale, non ideologica, ideale, che l'ha spinta a questa opera veramente impressionante. Fatto questo, e con una serie di evidenze assolutamente chiare, ma non note prima, Bina Agarwal ha anche intrapreso un'azione specifica di tipo politico per portare a modifiche istituzionali, a legislazione vigente, nel contesto dell'India. Ed ha avuto successo perché quelle norme discriminanti la successione ereditaria della terra sono state modificate. Ma secondo me in tutta una serie di nuance, apparentemente di nuance delle sue ricerche, sono uscite delle novità talmente dirompenti da rendere incredibile a noi stessi che non ci eravamo accorti prima di quello che stava succedendo. Per esempio, le patologie mortali per le donne, costrette talvolta a vivere in condizioni anche di combustione per i beni alimentari che generavano delle patologie cancerogene. Naturalmente Bina Agarwal è andata avanti negli anni e è riuscita anche a provare che le donne, quando vengono messe su un piano di parità degli uomini, danno un apporto molto significativo non solo al fattore riduttivo della produttività della terra, ma al fattore di conservazione della qualità delle terre stesse, cioè un'intelligenza particolare che evidenzia una complementarietà anche di genere, oltre che l'evidenza che dicevo prima, e cioè le discriminazioni di genere da vari punti di vista. Certe volte io mi interrogo su come mai una studiosa, ma io direi una studiosa, ma anche una persona che si è impegnata ben al di là di quella che era lo studio accademico, non abbia ancora trovato dei riconoscimenti, se non nella Balzan, che è stata molto, molto coraggiosa, perché a mio avviso ha evidenziato qualcosa di unico. Ha detto bene il presidente De Cleva, con un premio abbiamo conseguito 3 premi, ed è vero, ed è vero. Tuttavia io penso, e concludo rapidamente perché tutti noi siamo interessati a sentire Bina Agarwal, io credo che soprattutto nell'Agenda 2030, e cioè Sustainable Development Goal, ma anche io credo già in parte nella precedente versione Millennium Development Goal, il punto 5 del Sustainable Goal adesso parla dei diritti delle donne nella proprietà, rendendo evidente che questo è uno dei punti cruciali per superare il sottosviluppo, ma anche la discriminazione delle donne, che significa poi non promuovere quella che si chiama la crescita dell'essere delle persone, degli esseri umani. Io credo che il quinto goal risenta molto degli studi di Bina Agarwal. Per usare la metodologia controdeduttiva che usano i matematici, sono andato a leggermi bene tutti gli altri 17 development goal e farei fatica a identificare uno di questi goals, obiettivi, in una specifica tipologia di ricerca. Farei fatica. Da ultimo, per fare una colorazione molto marcata, Bina ha dimostrato come quell'idea, diciamo così, dogmatica di molti economisti, secondo i quali, di alcuni economisti, secondo i quali all'interno della famiglia non era importante chi aveva la proprietà o chi aveva dei diritti e chi non l'aveva, perché all'interno della famiglia tutto si ricomponeva in una specie di solidarietà ideale, per cui non c'era qualcuno che si avvantaggiava e qualcuno che veniva penalizzato, cosa che purtroppo alcuni economisti hanno scritto, addirittura facendo i calcoli sbagliati, che alla fine non c'era nessuna discriminazione perché alla fine tutti quanti guadagnavano quando anche uno era o fosse privilegiato e gli altri no. Quindi io credo che Bina rappresenti un grande esempio non solo come scienziata ma anche come persona che ha dedicato una parte importante della sua vita a quella che si può chiamare incivilimento, si può chiamare bene comune, si può chiamare solidarietà creativa. Ebbene, credo che abbia dato un contributo molto importante. Per questo la ringrazio e penso che continuerà a darci dei contributi importanti. Da ultimo, due notazioni molto personali. Una che io ho avuto l'onore come direttore di una rivista Economia Politica di averla invitata e che lei abbia accettato di stare nell'editorial board di Economia Politica, Journal of Institutional and Analytical Economics. E la seconda notazione è che uscirà ben presto il suo volume con la casa editrice Il Mulino, una raccolta di saggi fatta apposta per l'Italia con la casa editrice Il Mulino. Quindi questo mi fa molto piacere, perché anche in Italia è molto importante che la sua proposta, che non è solo la sua analisi, sia diffusa tra tutti e in particolare tra i giovani. Oggi ci parlerà Beyond Family Farming, Gendering the Collective, ma questo è quanto ci accingiamo a ascoltare. Ancora colgo l'occasione per ringraziare il Ministro Bellanova e Marco Fortis che in qualche modo ha reso possibile questo incontro. Anche Marco, qui faccio un po' di pubblicità, ma insomma bisogna anche avere che anche lui è nel board di Economia Politica e quindi grazie a Marco anche e al Ministro che è qui con noi oggi. Bina, the floor is to you.
Thank you so much. Professor Enrico De Cleva, Professor Curzio, Minister Teresa Bellanova, Marco Fortis, and distinguished friends. It is true, sometimes I feel one shouldn't actually get a translation because it is pretty embarrassing to have such a richness of praise. But thank you very much for those very, very kind words for Enrico and Alberto. And I warmly thank the Balzan Foundation and the Academy de Linchay for this invitation. As you know, I'm wearing the pin. And the Balzan ceremony in Bern was really remarkable and amazing. Prize ceremonies are often not fun, but this was not just extremely a big honor and very elegant, but also very enjoyable. So thank you very much to the Foundation and to the Academy for giving me this chance to present my work. Now in 2016, as we know, the UN launched the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was an ambitious one, a universal call to action to end poverty, to protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Now, food security, sustainable livelihoods, and social inclusion as we know, are key elements of these goals. Yet what is surprising is that rather little attention has been paid to the institutions that might be needed to deliver these goals. So although the SDGs talk about what we should achieve, they tell us rather little about how we should go about achieving them. So today what I will do is I will argue that the institutional transformation of agriculture is essential for increasing farm productivity, for improving farmer welfare, and for enhancing gender equality. In particular, we need another model of farming beyond small family farms which dominate agriculture globally. Numerically, family farms constitute 88% of the world's 500 million farms. If we match this with the statistic that 84% of all farms across 111 countries are under 2 hectares in size, then we can surmise that most family farmers are smallholders. And I thought that this challenge to the idea of small family farming would be appropriate to take up in Rome, which is also, of course, the headquarters of the FAO. I'm not sure if anybody from the FAO is here, but I think part of this is also directed to them. Now, small family farmers, of course, we know today are facing, in many countries, in many developing countries, are facing a crisis. And they have serious resource constraints, they have dwindling plot sizes, and fragmented holdings. And this is against the backdrop of climate change, of lack of growth of non-farm jobs, and a feminization of agriculture. In 2012, for instance, 43% of all farm workers in Asia, 47% in Africa were female. And these percentages, as you can see from some of these figures, were close to 50 in many Southeast and East Asian countries and have since been crossing over. Now, these percentages have been growing over time, and that is what I mean by a feminization of agriculture. Since typically what tends to happen is that more men than women tend to first move out to non-farm jobs, and they leave women to manage the farms. The one exception, so if you see this slide, as you can see, if the graphs go up, it means that the proportion of women to men is increasing among farm workers. The one exception is Europe, interestingly. As you can see, it's the only region where you can see the graph go down. And where one could argue that, in fact, there is a masculinization of farming. For reasons that are interesting and I think important possibly for people to explore. Elsewhere, and especially in developing countries, however, both the household's food security and a country's agricultural growth is likely to depend increasingly on the performance of women farmers. Women farmers, however, are even more resource constrained than small male farmers. So if you take land, which is the most important productive resource in rural areas, let us see how it's actually distributed. Now, what is remarkable is Professor Codrio Curzio mentioned that I wrote this book, A Field of One's Own, came out in 1994. And since then, I, and then increasingly many others, have been talking about the absence of gender disaggregated data on the ownership of land. And even if you take Thomas Piketty's famous book, it doesn't give you a particularly gendered analysis. So rather few countries give you gender disaggregated macro data on land ownership. But if you take some of the existing figures, you'll find that they are illustrative. So I culled together the information that we have today. And as you can see, if in Asia, there are only 4 countries, not including India, for which we have nationally representative figures, and only 14 to 37%, varying by country, of all landowners are women. In India, and this is something I've been working on for the past few months, I found that only 14% of landowners are women, owning only 11% of land. In Africa, you have Cheryl Doss put together the average for 10 countries, and you find overall that only 22% of landowners are women, including joint owners. In Latin America, the figures are 11 to 27%. Also, this doesn't even talk about the quality of land, which tends to be poorer for women than for men's plots. Now, these gender gaps reflect a male bias in inheritance laws, in government land distribution policies, and social norms. I've talked about this at great length in many writings, and I won't go over that. What is important is that even if you have the land, you have a gender bias in access to irrigation, to credit, to technology, and other essentials. And they have limited bargaining power with the state and in markets. So as a result, if you actually look at the studies in Africa and Asia, you find that women-managed farms have lower productivity than male-managed ones. At the same time, within male-managed family farms, women typically remain unpaid workers, lacking both autonomy in decision-making and independent identities as farmers. So what are the alternatives? I think we need to explore alternative models of farming beyond family farms and beyond individually managed female farms. Could a solution lie in group farming, which would involve land resource pooling and joint cultivation? Could this model help women farmers overcome their resource constraints and enhance their productivity and profits? Could it also empower them socially and politically and socially? I do want to mention that this is my ongoing work over the past more recent years. It's not a very popular topic, and you'll soon learn why, because of the history of what group farming might have meant. So before I go into the details of it, let's consider that history. Often when I say I'm working on group farming, people say, oh, you're working on cooperatives. So my answer is yes and no, because cooperatives can mean many things to different people. And I thought it's important to lay this out. So you can have cooperation in farming, which can range from what I call single purpose to multi-purpose to fully integrated. Now, globally, single-purpose marketing cooperatives are the most common. For instance, in the dairy industry in Europe, you'll have marketing cooperatives around dairy, which go back a few hundred years. And in India, the Amul cooperative, which has several million members, is another case in point. But in between, you can also have, excuse me. Yeah. You can have, between single purpose, you can move upwards, and then you have people investing jointly in machinery. So for instance, in France, you have CUMA, which is machine cooperatives, also in Canada. And also, if you go back more than a century in India, you have irrigation machines which are jointly owned by several farmers. But really, what I'm talking about is what I term fully integrated cooperation, which is group farming, which means pooling your land, labor, capital. You jointly cultivate, you market together, and you share the benefits and particularly sharing your labor on a daily basis. Now you'll say, well, the idea of group farming is not new, and you'll be right, because you have many examples, and I call them historically waves of collectives. Now the best known and the most infamous, if you like, are the socialist collectives which were formed through forced collectivization of peasant farms, and this we know today had seriously negative effects on output and welfare. But the second wave occurred in the 1960s, when farmer cooperatives were promoted mostly top-down in post-colonial countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as part of agrarian reform. You would have heard of the Ujamaa experiment in Tanzania, for instance. And Israel's kibbutz is another kind of example, if you like. But in most of the newly independent developing countries, these experiments largely failed or they had mixed effects. The third wave, if you like, was really in Europe in the 1960s. And I discovered this purely by chance because, my current work is not just on developing countries, but I was looking for global examples. I discovered that France has one of the oldest traditions of group farming. And most recently in September, just this September, I discovered so does Norway. And these are largely successful group farms, and they're largely male managed. And so, these pictures I've given are actually not just pretty pictures, but they have a purpose, and they'll give you some examples. The fourth wave was in the 1990s, where group farms emerged in many post-socialist countries, in Romania, in Kyrgyzstan, in East Germany, in Nicaragua. And here, farming families pooled together their resources to overcome land and machine constraints. And they did quite well in production, but they were mostly male-managed. In fact, all the earlier collective ventures, socialist and post-socialist, were highly gender unequal. So if you look at these, and this is what I meant by gendering the collective, is that in the USSR, women in collective farms were concentrated in manual jobs that were designated less skilled and usually carried lower pay. So only 0.8% of tractor owners, it's not 1% or 3%, 0.8% of tractor owners, 1.4% of machine handlers were female in the USSR. 84% of women employees compared to 66% of male workers were in jobs labeled unskilled. In socialist China and Vietnam again, women earned less work points than men, even though they were doing the harder tasks. Compared to this, collectivities which were formed in non-socialist regimes had a very different type of gender bias. Here, typically, the family was the unit, and women remained embedded in traditional divisions of labor. So even in France, until 2010, spouses could not form group farms until there was quite intensive lobbying by many women farmers, which led to change. However, the fifth wave of farm collectives, which occurred in India, are based on a very different model from all previous cases. In the 2000s, 2 states of India undertook experiments of all-women group farms. These initiatives are in these 2 states. There's Kerala, and then there is this is then later split into 2, Andhra Pradesh, but now in Telangana. And they encouraged rural women and only women to lease in land collectively, pool their labor and capital, and cultivate jointly. They are voluntarily constituted, egalitarian, and managed entirely by women. They are a collective of individuals, not a collective of family farms, and they recognize women as farmers in their individual capacity, outside the domain of family farms. So what that does is it gives women autonomy in decision-making and an independent identity as farmers. But then, of course, economists, myself included, will ask, okay, but how productive and profitable are they? So in order to answer this question, of course, you don't have large data sets being collected by anybody. And so to test this, I decided to do primary surveys in both the states during 2012 to 14 to compare a sample of group farms and individual family farms, 95% of which were male managed. So in fact, what you ended up was comparing all women group farms with predominantly male managed family farms. To date, barring my own work, current work, there's been little systematic empirical analysis of group farming in India or in any developing country, to my knowledge. So conceptually, we may expect, so you would say, okay, well, what could be the potential advantages of resource pooling and joint cultivation? Well, first of all, it could bring a number of economic benefits. They're not limited to women. They could be, you could think of them as benefits if any group of small farmers came together. What it would do was group farming would enlarge the farm size through pooling of owned or leased-in land, and this would increase the economic viability and so reap economies of scale. You remember in my earlier slide, I had mentioned that 84% of farmers across 111 countries cultivate 2 hectares or less, which are very small. Now, there was a very useful study done for all India by 2 American economists, Andrew Foster and Mark Rosenzweig, who showed that an increase in farm size from quite small to up to 8 hectares increases per hectare profits. And this is particularly the case as you move from under 2 hectares to up to 2 hectares. But apart from economies of scale, groups can also help save on hired labor. They can bring in a larger pool of funds and inputs. They provide a better diversity of skills than found in one person or family. They can help you experiment in risk-prone, higher-value crops with larger payoffs. They could spread losses through among a greater number. And you could better deliver on contracts and raise farmers' bargaining power in markets and governments. Now, these gains could accrue to any set of small farmers, but for women farmers, they could be particularly important because, as I had said, they face greater economic constraints. And also, a group would help women overcome social restrictions to public interaction and to mobility, and also control over output. And this is especially important in many developing countries. Now, of course, group farms can be constituted by leasing in land or by pooling a member's own land or a mix of them. But since rather few women own land, they may have few alternatives than the land lease model with its attendant constraints. Economic empowerment could lead to social and political empowerment, but let's consider the economic effects. So what I'm going to do in the body of my talk now is actually share with you the very detailed empirical work that I did in the 2 instances in India on what effect group farms had in comparison to individual family farming. And the basic model was the same in both the states, in Carolina and Telangana, where women will lease in land, they would pool their labor and capital, and they would share costs and benefits. Now, if the pooled land belonged to one of the group members, the rent was settled in advance, and the member was then expected to work like anybody else and give the same amount of labor and costs as the other members. This is a key institutional element. The women can also work on family farms alongside because there's task rotation, and this allows them enough flexibility to take up, sometimes if you come from a really poor household, to take up wage work in some seasons. Now in Kerala, the initial idea of group farming actually came from village women who found that there was fallow land and they decided to experiment with it by leasing it in groups. But then the overall program was crafted by senior government officials and intellectuals. And it was structured around a self-help group model which evolved from microcredit models. Many of you would know what a microcredit model is. What would be a microcredit model, for instance? Yes. Yes.
Of the group. So.
Yes, thank you. So as you know, the initial prototype of microcredit was started by Muhammad Yunus, the Bangladeshi, now Nobel laureate in the 1970s, and the groups are small, and they are relatively poor and relatively homogeneous. And from that model, the self-help group model emerged. Now, Kerala modified this by saying we don't want self-selection, we're going to have neighborhood groups, and everybody in the neighborhood, women in the neighborhood, 1 woman per household, would then do saving and credit. And the whole program was located in a multi-level structure of governance with 3 pillars. I'm going into these details a little bit because to say that group farming is not something that can just be formed spontaneously, and why the 1960s experiments failed. and why it's very important to bring in the issue of governance centrally into the launching of the program. So the first pillar was the government's anti-poverty program. The second pillar was the real innovative part of this. They formed what they called a Kudum Shri network, community network, which is community development societies at the village council level. And these were autonomous registered bodies in which the women were elected as office bearers. And these societies then mediate between the government and the village council, which was the third pillar, on behalf of the women's groups. Now, I'll skip over a little bit of the detail, which I'm happy to answer, but all the women who formed group farms had to be part of the neighborhood groups, although not all women in the neighborhood groups went into group farming. The groups did receive government support. They got access to subsidized credit through the government's Agricultural Development Bank. They also received some technical training and startup grant. All this, what did this do? What this did was give you a somewhat level playing field relative to the men. And today there are, can you guess, more than 64,000 such farms in Kerala alone. And if you multiply that by 6, average size of 6, you'll get the number of women. In the other state, which is Telangana, which was different, here it was the UNDP and the government of India, which decided to try a 5-year program. And it was actually implemented on the ground by a Kazai NGO, the APMSS, which had been set up prior to empower women through education. Now these APMSS, what it had created was women's collectives, one per village, and these pre-existing collectives took up group farming in 500 villages. And typically all the women in a former collective could actually take up group farming. Again, each group got a small grant, they got training, but much less so than in Kerala. And after 5 years, that support ended. But what is very encouraging is that in 2011, when I was traveling in this region, I discovered that 50% of the groups continued to farm, overseen by the NGO. So what I did was, I compared, so this is just 2 pictures, the top one for Kerala, the bottom one for Telangana. And as you see, typically you have pictures of women bending down and transplanting rice and so on. And this is a great change to have women use a power tiller. So I compared, in my data, the group farms in each state with small family farms of 2 hectares and less in the same state. To answer this question, how do they compare in productivity and profits? And in Kerala, the groups, there were 2 districts. In one, the main crop was paddy along with vegetables. In the other, the main crop was commercial bananas along with vegetables. My Kerala sample had 250 farms, 69 all-women's groups, and 181 individual family farms. The individual farms were the family farms of the women members, but selected randomly from among them. In Telangana, the sample consists of 763 farms, of which 70 are all women's groups and 693 are individual farms who own 2 hectares and less. And these individual farms are of 2 types. They are the Sangha women's family farms, and then there are non-group farms selected randomly from all farmers owning 2 hectares or less in the study villages. Now here's the difficult part. Often when you do studies like this, a survey, people go once, maybe once a month or once a season, and you collect your data. What does that miss? What that misses is that how many of us would even remember, and if you imagine villagers, well, 4 weeks ago or last month, how much time did you put in to weed the field? Memory recall is hardly accurate. So I decided to do something really ambitious and difficult, which was weekly data. We collected weekly data for every input and output and every type of labor used for every plot and every crop for an entire year. 12 months, in some cases 13 months. I'm not sure I'd ever do it again, but anyway, this is what I thought would be important to do. And in addition, we did focus group in terms of farmers' characteristics, their history, and so on. Now, just very broadly, what are their characteristics? Now, in Kerala, the group farms on average have 6 members. They're all literate. 2/3 have completed secondary school. And most importantly, groups are heterogeneous across caste and religious lines. And they include both poor and less poor homes. Now, Alberto, you would know from collective action theory that they would say, well, groups work well if they are homogeneous, relatively small and homogeneous. But in fact, they didn't go for that. They said that if you have complete homogeneity, and you have everybody is disadvantaged, then where will the leadership emerge from? So their idea was that leadership doesn't come always from the poorest, but you need people from just above the poverty line. Heterogeneity also, I discovered in my research, was that it broadens the social capital base of the group, especially when they're trying to access land. In contrast to this, in Telangana, and this is very key, the groups were very large. There were 22 members. Some groups had 50 members. Most were low caste. 38% were illiterate. Now, they went for homogeneity. In both states, almost all the women members came from small landholding families, and the group farms were twice the area of the individual family farms. So in the case of Kerala, where most farms are very small, they move from 0.35 hectares to 1 hectare for the group farms. And in the case of Telangana, they were individual family farms of 1 hectare, and the groups were 2 hectares. Now, women's groups, despite forming groups, had 4 initial advantages relative to the male-run family farms. Firstly, they depended on leasing land. Now, when you don't own land and you go into the market and you say, well, I want to lease land, it has high transaction costs. To find suitable land, you may find a plot here, you may find a plot there. How do you find a consolidated plot? And it creates insecurity of tenure because in India, land leasing is not legal. And so, unlike if you take France, where you have 9-year leases and there's fairly secure leases and so on, and that's the case in Europe. Now, land access was the biggest hurdle, especially in Telangana, because since most of the women came from the lowest caste, the community itself did not have a lot of land. And because their social networks were depended on, especially on the community, they had great difficulty in accessing land. So here's a quotation from the women. The landlords in the village think that since all our members belong to the scheduled caste community, if they lease to us, we will get the land title in the group's name. So none of them are prepared to lease the land to us. Also, if you have oral leases, you don't have a document which says, this is a farmer, they're leasing in land, you can't access government subsidies because you can't actually prove that you are a farmer. Thirdly, of course, women face structural biases in access to land, to inputs, and all the sorts of things I talked about. And fourthly, although they had been working on their family farms, they didn't have experience in managing farms, and that's a big difference. Now, some of these disadvantages were, of course, overcome because they got training and so on and state support, but it didn't overcome all the disadvantages. Now, I'll just mention one more problem with forming a collective. So let's say the 4 of you decide to form a collective, and you're all very enthusiastic, and you all turn up for work today, and 5 days later you'll say, I think I'm sorry, but I can't come for work today. Or you don't even tell us that you're not coming for work today because you have something else happening in your life. So the ability of a group to say, okay, everybody must come for work is a big challenge in any form of collective action. So what did these groups do? So this is what they did. So here are various methods of dealing with absenteeism. So as you can see, one was that if you can't come for work, then you have somebody else replace you. It could be a daughter-in-law, it could be a husband, a son, a grandson. If none of them can replace you, you have to pay a fine, or you have to pay a wage equivalent for somebody who's going to be hired in your place. Or you say, okay, I'm going to work extra time. Sometimes the conflict cannot be resolved. And in very rare cases, they say, well, you've just been absent for too long, we're not going to share the profits with you. So these are things that we don't think about. We think of groups as in romantic ways, but in fact, these are very real problems of collective action. But they do have a mechanism of dealing with that. Despite these challenges, okay, how well did these women's collectives work compared to male-managed family farms? So this is a very straightforward model. People who don't like economics can just ignore it. But basically, what I've done is that what I want to measure is whether there is a difference between the annual value of output of group farms versus individual family farms. And so what you have is different types of farms, the group farms and other farms, control for various sorts of inputs, fertilizer, manure, and so on, and labor, whether they have irrigation or not, what kind of cropping pattern they have, and then some demographic variables, and then a control for district fixed effects. So how did they do? It's $1 million question. Well, Kerala did strikingly well, and Telangana less so. So let's just look at the cross tabs first. So here's Kerala. In Kerala, if you take both districts together, group farms compared to individual farms in terms of annual value of output had 1.8 times higher annual value of output. Also in the major commercial crop banana, group farms had 1.6 times the value, the average yields of individual farms. Only in paddy, rice, they didn't do so well. And there's a reason for that, which I'll come to. Now this is just a cross tabulation, but I've done the standard regressions. I won't spend too much time on it, but the thing to focus on is here, negative means that the individual farms are less productive than the group farms, and the usual thing of what are the significant variables. Labor is particularly important, and the cropping pattern. Now, the banana, I wanted to share this with you because there is a big difference between the results for banana and the results for paddy. The results for banana is that the group farms do hugely better than the individual farms. In fact, a shift from individual to group farms is linked with an increase in output of 348%. Now, the banana story is very important. I don't know how many of you know that India is one of the biggest producers of banana globally. That, all farmers, what they try and do is when they're producing banana is that they harvest in a way that they can get higher prices by calibrating it during festival seasons. But the women's groups are able to work the market particularly well. So some of them have negotiated contracts with local temples to supply a very special organic farm of banana variety. And as a group, they are much more able to guarantee delivery than if you're an individual small farmer. So that's part of the banana story. The story for rice is a less happy one. And the reason for that is that paddy requires very, very good soil to do really well. And so what you find is because women are depending on leasing in land, the male farmers don't want to lease their best land out, and therefore they do much better in paddy, the men do, than the women's groups. So this is the Kerala story. It is a very positive story. What about Telangana? I'm afraid Telangana is a very complex and less happy story, because here the group farms do worse than the individual family farms in the annual value of output for all crops and for food grains in particular. But they don't do so badly in the case of cotton. So I'll take you quickly to the, so here's the results for food grain, and here's the results for cotton. As you can see, here the group farms, the individual family farms do much better than the group farms in paddy. But this is not the case in cotton, where they don't do any significantly worse. So what does this tell us? This is telling us that you're not doing very well in the group farm, women's group farms, if you're growing food grains, which are traditional crops. But you're doing as well, or even substantially better, if you're doing commercial farming. Now, this goes a bit against the grain. As you know, you must have some of you would have read literature, which says, well, for food security, what you should do is grow your own food. You should grow food grains. And it's a common assumption within civil society. But what it actually does is it leaves the women's groups vulnerable to low output in semi-arid zones with limited irrigation. And with climate change, what you're going to get is that this effect is going to get deepened. So I think we need to question this myth that women farmers responsible for food security should be growing food crops. After all, you and I don't necessarily grow our own food crops. The second bit is on net returns, profitability. Now, the way I calculated profits was that I deducted all paid out costs from the total value of output, but I didn't impute values to owned land or family labor. And in Kerala, most of the farmers, individual family farmers and group farms, have positive net returns. But for group farms, the average net returns for farm are strikingly higher than individual family farms. And in fact, if you see, it's really, they're 5 times higher, the profits of the group farms compared to individual family farms, and they are statistically significant. Now, what these results demonstrate, and this is also true per hectare, I've given you per farm results, that despite the difficulties of leasing land, women's group farms outperform individual male farmers in small-scale commercial farming. And even Telangana, which, as you know, didn't do so well in terms of overall productivity, in terms of net returns, does quite well. And it does so because the large groups save hugely on hired labor. And labor costs, hired labor costs in peak seasons are pretty high. So then the obvious question is, well, why did Kerala do so much better compared to Telangana? So here is my 2 bits of explanation. There are several reasons, but I put them together as 5 reasons. Firstly, state support. Government support in Kerala, including technical training and incentives, was very important. Whereas in the case of Telangana, this support ended after 5 years. Now, don't forget that male farmers also get government support. It isn't that women don't, but here it was more targeted to level the playing field. Also, we have a subsidized credit program. Now, what is interesting is that the subsidized credit program is not limited either to women farmers, nor is it limited to Kerala. But the Kerala women took advantage of it. Their groups took advantage of it, which Telangana women did not. The second was the institutional structure, the 3-pillar structure, which I won't spend more time on. I've already talked to you about it. The third is group composition and size. You remember I said that Kerala's groups were more heterogeneous. They were educated, relatively younger, and had wider social networks. Telangana's groups were largely composed of scheduled caste poor women with limited social base, and many were illiterate. Then group size. Now, you see, if you think of social empowerment of women, you would say, well, the larger the number, the better, right? If 50 people show up outside, a government office, they'll have much more impact than 6 women show up. However, when you're talking about economic empowerment, other factors come into play, because the larger the group, the less the per capita returns, the more the problems of coordination. So I think group size is very important, and the initial idea of small groups is important. And then production conditions. Kerala chose commercial crops, had better land access because of social capital, and it has a favorable ecology, high rainfall and irrigation. Whereas Telangana lost because of an overemphasis on food grains in semi-arid conditions with poor irrigation. And then the way the program is conceptualized. This was the point I was making earlier, that Kerala conceptualized the program as an economic empowerment program which could lead to social empowerment. Whereas Telangana conceptualized it much more. Initially, it was a pre-existing social empowerment program onto which the economic program was grafted. Nevertheless, in both cases, what is important is that it did provide women farmers an important alternative to unpaid work on family farms. Now, there are things that happen when you form a group which go beyond production and beyond the economy. And this is about enhanced capabilities. As we know, Amartya Sen has talked a lot about capabilities in particular contexts, but capabilities, improvement of capabilities, broadly defined, can transform lives. So I'll give you a few examples. Firstly, in both states, women have developed strong identities as farmers in their own right, rather than being simply seen as laborers or farm wives. So for instance, here's a quote: "Group farming has enriched my farming experience. Through the group, I realized that I had good leadership qualities and could also manage the technical aspects of farming. Other group members now listen to me carefully." The second is that they've become much more familiar with a range of institutions, which normally their husbands or sons or somebody else would be mediating with. So they get direct contacts with government officials, with bank officials, with agricultural officers, and so on. And then they learn to negotiate in multiple markets. Now, these are things which male farmers would just take for granted. You go into a market, you negotiate storage, and it would all be fine. But actually, for women to go into the marketplace, they were completely invisible earlier, and even going there and then negotiating storage was a big deal. Most importantly, of course, they learned to make production decisions and manage the farms independently. In addition, you have social empowerment. Questions that we as economists, you can't actually give a figure to it. What does it mean to be respected? So if you're a low-caste woman and the upper-caste landlord won't call you by your proper name, won't ask you to sit down, this is the fact that you're asked to sit down, you're respected, is something which can't be measured and has very important empowerment outcomes, which can have also economic outcomes. So this is what they're saying: questions of respect, questions of recognizing that women can have knowledge, and they have and their sense of identity. So I won't spend time reading, but this is very common. That before I joined the group, nobody knew me by my own name. I'm such and such's wife, and now I'm known by my own name. In addition, what's very interesting is that increasingly many of these women are standing for village council elections and they're winning. Okay, so what are my broader reflections? I think firstly, the analysis shows that institutional innovations can prove key to economic gains. And we can also learn what should be done and what should not be done. So Kerala gives us many of the do's and Telangana many of the don'ts. But overall, in both states, I would argue that group farming can level the playing field for women to a considerable degree. Secondly, we also find that farmers' collectives can reduce the effects of state failure and market failure for the disadvantaged, even though it cannot overcome all the inequalities, as in land ownership. And thirdly, and this is something I'm working on now as well, is that we need to revisit collective action theory. As you know, that a lot of the collective action theory has been around around the commons, has been around the protection of water bodies or forests, as did Ellen Ostrom's work. But we do need a somewhat different approach when we're talking about collective action around private property. So towards the end, let me ask you a question which I have a feeling will be on the minds of many of you, which is, do the groups necessarily have to be all women's groups? Am I right that some of you had this in mind? Well, my answer is yes and no. So, now, you see, what are the advantages of all women's groups? What does it mean? Now, many grassroots activists argue that all women's groups cooperate better, that they're less prone to conflicts. And when conflicts do occur, they get resolved. They don't escalate in the way that conflicts in men's groups tend to do. You may or may not accept this, but if you do accept it, one can argue that this is probably because, not because women are less prone to conflict, but because they are much more dependent on each other in the villages in developing countries. So for instance, I've been told by some of the groups, well, what's the point of fighting today? Because tomorrow I will have to go with her to fetch water, or I will have to borrow some sugar from her, or something else. So they resolve this. The second is that no matter whether you're a rich woman or a poor woman in a village, you face social norms which affect all of you towards your mobility. I also found that in other contexts, in my own research on community forestry management in India and Nepal, that women were much more likely to participate in decision-making in groups if there was a critical mass. And in that, I actually tried to measure critical mass, and I found that indeed 25 to 33% was the percentage which mattered. I also found that all women's groups protecting forests in Nepal had significantly better conservation outcomes than mixed groups or groups with men, all male groups. Similarly, just think about it. When Grameen Bank or self-help groups started, you had a large proportion of both all male and all female groups. You've ended up, both in microcredit and self-help groups, over 90% with all female groups, with excellent repayment records. So obviously there are differences in the way that women cooperate and men cooperate, which is leading to this result. But at the same time, we have to be cautious because political power and economic resources are largely concentrated with men. So dependence solely on all women's groups can prove restrictive. So we also need gender-balanced mixed groups. Finally, let me end with a very brief focus on a concept that has caught the international imagination based on the idea of groups and cooperation. Can you guess what the concept is? I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the concept of social solidarity economy. Now, while the idea of, I don't know if I have this here. Yeah. Now, while the idea of social solidarity economy is still evolving and there isn't full agreement on what it means, but where there is agreement is that it covers various forms of citizens' associations, social movements, self-help groups, and so on, which cooperate in production and exchange in inclusive ways, and they interact with states and markets on behalf of citizens. But this does not address a key question: what motivates people to cooperate? Is it just enlightened self-interest, or is there some sense of solidarity beyond self-interest? I believe it is helpful to distinguish what I term strategic solidarity as versus empathetic solidarity. Now, the examples of group farming in my study display both. So these women began with strategic solidarity. They came together because they thought coming together in a group would bring economic gain through group farming. But over time, empathetic solidarity has also emerged. Women extend help to each other in times of need. They visit each other in hospital if somebody is ill. And in Telangana, there are a number of elderly women in the Telangana group. So I asked them, well, why are these elderly women there? Because they will not be able to contribute labor. So I was told, but they provide experience and knowledge. But I think what was also happening here was empathetic solidarity. They didn't want to leave people outside simply because they felt they were less productive. So while collectives may initially be built on enlightened self-interest for strategic benefits, as we think about the many problems facing our societies and economies, moving from self-interest to other regarding interest, and from individual to collective responsibility is deeply necessary. And this is not necessarily only a female trait. I believe it's a universal trait, one which even Adam Smith, that great doyen of free competition, recognized in his theory of moral sentiments. And he said, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Indeed, as many group farmers, both women and men, argue, cooperation is often worth it simply because you enjoy working together. Thank you.
È assolutamente evidente che commentare questa splendida annual Balzan lecture di Bina Agarwal superebbe la straordinaria intensità della sua ricerca, della sua proposta, e alla base della ricerca e della proposta sta una grandissima competenza nell'analisi economica, nella psicologia sociale, nell'antropologia e anche nel sacrificio personale, perché quando ci si dice che venivano fatti dei controlli settimanali per paragonare l'andamento della produttività e dei focus group per capire, si può intendere quanto sacrificio ci stia dentro tutto ciò. All'inizio vi dicevo che quando Bina è stata eletta vicepresidente dell'International Economic Association vi era verso di lei ammirazione, ma anche un certo timore perché la sua enfasi motivata sugli aspetti di solidarietà umana come fattore di sviluppo anche economico turbava quelle che erano le concezioni strettamente mercatistiche che guardavano al funzionamento del mercato come sufficiente per assorbire ogni altra capacità di funzionamento dei sistemi economici. Bina cita il mercato, non c'è dubbio, ma non risolve i problemi del sottosviluppo in quelle forme di iperliberalizzazione dove le istituzioni perdono quel ruolo di coordinamento e di stimolo, ma neppure nello stesso tempo ci propone un modello collettivista nel quale l'istituzione decide per tutti. E quindi qualche volta a me viene di distinguere e comparare due forme di solidarietà, tutte e due importanti, ma una per molti versi più importante dell'altra. La solidarietà caritatevole, che è molto importante, e la solidarietà creativa, che proietta quindi le capacità degli esseri umani e soprattutto l'esempio che ci ha fatto anche dell'inizio di Graham Bank, uomini e donne quasi in parità, e poi alla fine il 90% erano donne, perché hanno una sensibilità sociale molto marcata, ma nello stesso tempo non trae delle conclusioni erronee da questo per femminilizzare tutto, perché è la combinazione delle due capacità che rende il sistema sociale, economico e anche istituzionale più proficuo. Detto questo, se ci sono degli interventi, io vorrei invitare il Ministro, se vuole dirci due parole, ci farebbe molto piacere. La sua presenza qua non dico che sia qualcosa di assolutamente nuovo, perché spesso abbiamo avuto dei ministri, ma in una circostanza del genere è assolutamente nuovo, e quindi le siamo molto grati per la sua presenza e le saremmo anche grati se volesse darci alcune sue valutazioni. Noi conosciamo la sua ammirevole testimonianza di impegno, di lavoro e di vita, e quindi lei ci porta una testimonianza, non ci porta solo un'opinione, come Bina ci ha portato una testimonianza e non solo una competenza straordinaria di riflessione economica. Prego.
Grazie. Buonasera a tutti e a tutte, e grazie al professor Quadrio Curzio per avermi invitato a questa prestigiosa occasione di approfondimento che trovo di massimo interesse. Desidero innanzitutto esprimere il mio sentito e sincero apprezzamento alla Fondazione Balzan, all'Accademia dei Lincei e di nuovo al professor Quadrio Curzio, che ha organizzato questa serata permettendoci di approfondire la conoscenza di Bina Agarwal. Figura straordinaria a livello internazionale, non solo dal punto di vista della scienza e della conoscenza, ma anche per la sua eccezionale testimonianza di impegno personale, sociale, civile e quindi politico. Mi fa molto piacere essere qui e sono grata al professore Fortis per avermi dato questa opportunità costruendo questa relazione anche tra di noi. Sono molto contenta di essere qui perché il tema di questa serata mi riguarda, ci riguarda. E l'approccio e le proposte della professoressa Agarwal sono preziosi perché indicano concretamente la via del cambiamento. Temi come lavoro agricolo e condizione delle donne in agricoltura sono parte cruciale della mia esperienza. La mia scuola di vita inizia lì. Lì ho conosciuto e sperimentato l'ingiustizia profonda dello sfruttamento del lavoro, il caporalato, su di me, sulle mie compagne di lavoro. Per questo, da sindacalista, mi sono battuta per difendere le donne e il lavoro delle donne, non solo per la parità salariale, ma anche per difendere il nostro corpo, la nostra dignità, perché controllo e asservimento spesso equivalgono per i caporali a tentare di appropriarsi non solo del lavoro, ma del corpo stesso delle donne. Essere ministra oggi mi carica di una responsabilità importante. Nelle prime ore al Ministero ho pensato alle compagne braccianti che non hanno avuto la mia stessa fortuna, che hanno pagato con la vita condizioni di lavoro indicibili. Una storia che in parte dura ancora, perché le varie forme di sfruttamento sono gli anelli di una robusta catena che pesa tuttora sull'universo femminile, in tutto il mondo. Come ci ricorda la FAO, nei paesi in via di sviluppo le donne costituiscono il 45% della forza lavoro agricola, dal 20% dell'America Latina al 60% in alcune zone dell'Africa e dell'Asia. Lavorano 12-13 ore in più a settimana, dovunque, hanno meno probabilità di possedere la terra e sono loro a soffrire di più la fame e la povertà alimentare. Ecco perché gli studi della professoressa Agarwal sono cruciali per comprendere le dinamiche del settore agricolo anche in rapporto alla dimensione di genere, quanto mai importante, e per individuare soluzioni che promuovono la crescita economica senza aumentare le disuguaglianze e senza provocare un impatto negativo sull'ambiente. E poi perché se vogliamo raggiungere davvero l'obiettivo fame zero nel 2030, dobbiamo tutti insieme affrontare il tema di come spezzare la catena che imprigionano la produttività femminile. Come possiamo trasferire sapere e innovazione alle piccole aziende condotte da donne? Come consentire loro un accesso paritario alle risorse? Già solo garantendo alle donne un migliore accesso alla proprietà dei terreni si potrebbe ridurre di centinaia di milioni di persone la fame che oggi colpisce 820 milioni di donne, uomini e bambini. Senza dimenticare che le donne reinvestono fino al 90% dei loro guadagni nelle loro famiglie, assicurando così una migliore educazione alimentare ai figli e liberandoli dal gioco della povertà. Sono le donne la forza propulsiva della lotta alla disuguaglianza, perché siamo noi le prime a subirla. La professoressa Agarwal si concentra sui paesi in via di sviluppo, dove l'agricoltura è spesso il settore che coinvolge il più alto numero di lavoratori, ma dal quale raramente ci si aspetta una spinta allo sviluppo e alla crescita. Ribaltando questo assunto, le sue analisi sulle diverse forme organizzative dell'economia agricola e sul fondamentale apporto delle donne in questi contesti fanno emergere le potenzialità di questo comparto, sottolineando gli interessanti e direi rivoluzionari risultati che un diverso modo di fare agricoltura può portare in termini di migliori condizioni di vita, uguaglianza di genere, impatto ambientale e giustizia sociale. Permettetemi di estendere queste riflessioni ai paesi cosiddetti sviluppati e al nostro in particolare. Anche in Italia abbiamo molto lavoro da fare. Ho accennato prima al doloroso e ancora attuale problema del caporalato, sfruttamento dei lavoratori e delle lavoratrici e violazione dei diritti sono aspetti ancora presenti e non solo nelle nostre campagne. Le differenze salariali sono ancora molto diffuse, vanno combattute e dobbiamo garantire alle donne la possibilità di conciliare vita professionale e vita familiare. Se una donna deve scegliere tra lavoro e figli, abbiamo perso tutti. Come governo stiamo lavorando per dare risposte anche semplici. Gli asili nido gratuiti che abbiamo proposto nel pacchetto famiglia sono un'azione concreta. In agricoltura circa il 30% delle aziende è condotto da donne, troppo poche. Nel Ministero, su 13 direttori generali, ho trovato solo una donna. C'è moltissimo da lavorare. E per le donne imprenditrici di qualsiasi età, nella legge di bilancio abbiamo inserito il bonus donne in campo, mutui a tasso zero per investire, far crescere le aziende, creare occupazione. Diamo credito alle donne perché sono sicura sapranno restituire con interessi questa fiducia in termini di migliore gestione del territorio, di comunità più forti, di produzioni più sostenibili, di salvaguardia della biodiversità. Come ci dice proprio la professoressa Agarwal, quando ci sono più donne a gestire risorse come le foreste, si ha una maggiore attenzione alla conservazione e questo è importante in un'ottica di sviluppo sostenibile. Una lezione da tenere a mente anche dinanzi a quel che di rovinoso e drammatico sta accadendo in questi giorni nel nostro Paese a causa del maltempo e della crisi climatica. Ecco perché gli studi della professoressa devono costituire un punto di riferimento anche per il nostro Paese, stimolando la riflessione su modi di fare agricoltura più equi e più sostenibili dal punto di vista economico, sociale e ambientale, fornendo idee innovative in merito all'organizzazione del lavoro, alle dimensioni e alla guida delle imprese agricole, alla presenza delle donne e delle giovani donne soprattutto, e supportando noi decisori nell'azione di misure più giuste ed efficaci che favoriscano la crescita e una maggiore giustizia sociale. La Costituzione italiana esprime i valori della solidarietà e del lavoro, della laboriosità e dell'occupazione per lo sviluppo umano in forme molto avanzate. Spetta a noi tutti ritrovare nella situazione storica e geografica in cui viviamo le condizioni per dare concretezza a questi valori nei quali si realizzano nella parità di genere gli uomini e le donne. Io vi ringrazio davvero per avermi tirata fuori da emergenze, contingenze di cui mi sto occupando al Ministero e avermi dato l'opportunità di ascoltare una persona che considero davvero straordinaria e di avere l'opportunità di condividere con voi queste brevi riflessioni. Grazie ancora.
Molto al Ministro Bellanova per questo suo intervento davvero importante che configura la nostra serata anche con un sostegno istituzionale di significato molto alto. Io non so se sicuramente Bina accetta delle domande e quindi chi volesse fare delle riflessioni o porre dei quesiti è qui Bina pronta a rispondere. Vedo una mano in fondo, io chiederei cortesemente di dire il proprio nome perché c'è la registrazione e questo è importante, e poi se è possibile alzarsi in modo che sia facile individuare la persona. Prego.
Buongiorno, buonasera, io sono Olivier Cosse della FAO. Mi dispiace, il mio italiano non è tanto buono, allora ho fatto la domanda in inglese.
Okay.
I work in FAO and I've written about and studied feminization of agriculture quite a lot. And I would like to ask you a question about those female farmers. One of my sort of intuition, is that if there is feminization of agriculture, as there is in quite a number of countries, there might be a need also for feminization of support to agriculture. By that I mean the veterinary services, the extension services, and any other, systems of support for agriculture. And it could go way beyond this. It could go also in mechanization. It could go into, your farmer tiller the picture you showed might perhaps, I don't know, that's my question, be better adapted to female farmers if it was a bit lighter, for example. I don't want to sound condescending or cliche-ridden here, but it might be a fact that it works better for them. So my question is, discussing with them, did you get the feeling that perhaps the support system for agriculture also may need to change to be better adapted to female farmers? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I take that? Or?
Ci sono altre domande? Ecco, allora facciamo così. You prefer to have three questions and then to answer to three? Okay, please.
No, so why don't I answer that one first and then take back to them. I realize that they'll be of different kind.
Okay, different kind.
So thank you very much. I'm very happy that somebody from FAO is here. And you're absolutely right. Firstly, on adapting technology, it's extremely important to do that because, in fact, in the Telangana case, it was part of the discussion with the women that, is there ways by which we could develop tools which are maybe lighter, maybe just more efficient for women to be able to use, and test it with them in mind. There's also work, other aspects. So for instance, there's work in Africa, as you probably know about it, that if you do experiments, if you test things in the farmers' fields, it makes a big difference to the absorption of that technology. And typically the male extension agents don't go into the women's farmers' fields. They tend to go to the men's farmers' fields. So many of us, in fact, have been talking a great deal about having women village-level workers, which are extension agents. Now, I remember there was huge discussion on this in the late 80s and early 90s, but somehow we have retrogressed. We've just forgotten about it. So we need to bring it back. But I also felt that I think there's a whole generation of women farmers today who are less hesitant in being able to communicate or access, even if the VLW is a male. even if the extension worker is a male. If there's a group of women, they are more able to overcome social barriers. So while you're right, in many ways you have to have a feminization, as you say, of support services, but perhaps less so than would have been the case, say, 20 years ago. Just a little footnote that, I've also been doing a survey in France, in Ain and Saône-et-Loire, just, it finished a year ago, and I've been analyzing. And one of the women farmers that we interviewed there, she said that the machines are so large for me that I have to get my brother or my father to operate them. So I think this idea of the feminization of support services isn't just about, 5'2", my height, farmers, but is also the case for European women. And I'm sure the minister will have examples from Italy where we could do with that, correct? Yes. Thank you.
You, Bina, for your answer. Please, Professor, I would like you to say your name and you stand up, so it's much easier to have the recording of...
Allora, sì, sono Giulia Zacchia della Sapienza e grazie mille appunto per il seminario, è stato veramente toccante, anche l'intervento veramente concreto e quello che serve. E, io ho una provocazione, diciamo, per quanto riguarda la raccolta dati su Kerala. Si è parlato anche della presenza di technical training, cioè quindi dei corsi di formazione. Quindi mi chiedo, c'è un ruolo anche che le università possono giocare in questa partita? È veramente quindi la possibilità di inserire questo, terza missione, cioè questo impatto sociale che possono avere le università anche in concreto sulla società e come può operare? E quindi qui la provocazione potrebbe essere questa. Abbiamo parlato di social solidarity economy e potrebbe esserci anche una social solidarity knowledge che va integrata anche in questo attraverso il ruolo delle università?
Thank you. I'll take more than one. Yeah, sure. Is that okay, Julia? Yes.
Hi. My name is Itaskun. I'm a postdoc at Sapienza, as Julia come from. Thank you so much for your inspiring lecture, Professor Agarwal. So I have two questions. The first one is in some way related to the first question, but at the beginning of your lecture, you said that the agriculture sector in Europe is going through a masculinization. So I would like to know your stand or the potential causes driving that, and to what extent, for instance, the skill bias, technological change might be acting in some way. And the second question was related to the different the successful story in Kerala and not so such successful in Telangana. So I was thinking about, could you identify some differences in terms of gender norms or social norms that differentiate between these two regions that might be also a force driving these different degrees of successful?
Okay, thank you. So let me answer those two. Shall I do that? Yes, let me answer that, and then we can take another small round. So thank you very much for those both those comments and questions. I think universities have a big role to play. So in fact, in the examples, in my examples as well, the university, agricultural university were drawn in Kerala, for instance, they were drawn in by the government to provide training as well. And in fact, when I talked about the 3-pillar structure, where the community networks were able to negotiate on behalf of the women with the government and so on. When you visit, you'll find that many of the officers have come from either the agricultural ministry of the government or also from universities and seconded to work on this program for women's training. And many of them love it, so they want, if they're sent back, they want to come back again. So it is a big role to play. Just as a footnote, I might mention that I found this also in Brazil. In 2012, I traveled with a group of agroecologists and agricultural teachers in Brazil, in Minas Gerais. And they were playing a very important role on the ground by taking up a farmer's problem and saying, okay, this is the way you could possibly solve it. Because as you know, agroecology has a whole growing movement now, but there's also the food sovereignty movement in Brazil. So yes, I think a big role to play. Social solidarity knowledge. Absolutely. What's interesting is that in the Kerala example, they picked up some women. Is there a? I thought we had only mosquitoes in India, but I think clearly not. In the Kerala example, they actually picked up, they brought in women who, I'm sorry, they trained as master farmers. So they said that instead of depending entirely, and this is to your question also, that instead of depending entirely on the government, let's train women within the community, and they will be available to the women's groups. And what is very interesting is that in the paper that I circulated, there's more evidence that one of the empowering effects for the women was that they say, well, now the male farmers ask us for knowledge and what we should be doing. And for them, that's a first, because typically they were not supposed to be seen as repositories of technical knowledge. So yes, so that is another way of social solidarity knowledge, if you like, spreading. And then there's, well, we can talk more about it. Your question about masculinization, firstly, I suspect that Europe needs to be disaggregated, because I gave you a sort of very broad aggregation. And I'm sure you'll find differences in Southern Europe versus Northern Europe, and even within Europe, like as you mentioned, Southern Italy versus Northern Italy. I'm not 100% sure why you see this difference, the masculinization of farming in Europe. It isn't, in France at least I can say that many of these women are actually doing the work of accountants in the group farms. So they provide a technical skill which the husbands don't have. And typically women are seen as not very good in math and science and so on, but in this case they are providing the skills. So I think there's a very good topic for a postdoc to take up as to why it is happening. Kerala and Telangana don't differ in terms of social norms. It's South India they don't face the same constraints as Northern India. It has much more to do with the other factors that I talked about. One final...
the final one is Professor Brunori, who has been the president of the class of Natural, Mathematical and Physical Sciences of Lincei.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's not a technical question, mine, because I'm not... but I just wanted to try extrapolating to a single point this very broad view of your work. I mean, many years. When I go back home, my wife couldn't come. She wanted to come, but couldn't come, and she would ask me to condense in a sentence or so, or just a few sentences. So I was very impressed by one fact that you mentioned, that this group of women preferred to be all women. It was more productive in some way, easier to handle, and social relationships and so on. And is this because this is going to be so simple that it's going to be, inaccurate? Of course, simplification is too much. Is that because this would allow them to maintain and defend better the dignity that they have acquired, which seems to be, as you said, I mean, an important component. Sit down, say, become a person that has. Is that because being together, all women may feel more secure that their dignity will be preserved, so to speak?
Okay. I think there are two elements to your question. One is all women's groups, why they're so successful, right? And the other is the effect of coming together on non-economic aspects. So on the first, as I said, I think one could make a general claim that people who are much more interdependent are more likely to cooperate than people who are not. And in context of scarcity, whether it's scarcity of knowledge or scarcity of resources, you'll have much more to gain to cooperate than if you didn't cooperate. So I think in that sense, the gender, the fact that women work together has at least a substantial part to do with their interdependence and lack of relative disadvantage in access to resources. But the question of the impact of forming a group, which is the non-economic impact of questions about dignity, about respect, yes, it does. I think it's forming groups does make a big difference. There is still a question: would simply forming a group make a difference, or forming a group for economic purpose make a difference? I feel, from the base of my research, is that bringing in economic gain into the family and where the community makes an additional difference. Yes, an additional. So many examples of social movements indicate that if women come together in groups, they are better respected in communities. But if they come together for economic purpose and demonstrably show that they are productive and they're bringing in an income, an independent sources of income, then I believe it makes a particular difference to dignity. And the two elements to the dignity: one is the community recognizing you as important, and the other is within your family, your intra-household dynamics makes a difference. I was very struck by one quote by one of the women who said, you know, for the first time, after they formed the group and they brought an income back, my husband took me to the cinema. Now, you know, this is, for her, that was a big deal. That is a big deal. Yeah. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Bina, for your moving and thoughtful thought, from which I've learned quite a lot. I don't want to comment because it would be a kind of downgrading what she said, and so I don't want to do that. Before closing this meeting, I have to add 2 words about other initiative on which I am, and Bina, I am trying to involve Bina in other initiatives which have to do with the women in developing countries, scientist women in developing countries, and I hope to be able to do something next year, but we are not yet ready to say something about that. In any case, before closing this meeting, I have to say, in another capacity, that this is the 10th annual Balzan lecture. As you know, Balzan Foundation every year does one annual Balzan lecture, which is held by one of prize winner, and this is the 10th one, because the first one started in 2010, and as far as I know, this is the first one from an economist, a social scientist, and an institutional scientist, and also by a person who has put quite a lot of her life into the common goods and progress and gender parity and all these fantastic aim for human development. Having said that, I have also to give a new thanks to the Minister, to Professor De Cleva, and to all the people here, and finally to say that Accademia dei Lincei is grateful to you if you want to participate to a small drink at the end of this palace, just the other side. Many thanks to all of you, and I hope to have here Bina next time, a new time. And I have a final word. Bina is a fellow of Lincei, of course, and she has the pin here, which is the links. And luckily, it seems that the links is again back to Umbria, and this is a good news after all. Thanks. Thanks.
I also want to just thank everybody for coming and for the minister, and thank you very much for your remarks of, if I may say, solidarity. And I hope that there'll be other occasions where we might collaborate to take things forward. Thank you, and thank you everybody. Thank you.